Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I have nothing to say. Like life is just fine. I worked a lot of hours. Now I'm not working. There you go. It's my weekend. Yeah.
Nice. Well, welcome to your weekend.
Thank you. I love, particularly that we're recording on Mondays, on a Monday, and I love Mondays because I get to record with you. I get to translate with my friend. I get to edit last week's episode. I get to get ready for sermon prep. It's a lot of theological discussion, book reading, Bible reading. It's just a good day. So I'm at the beginning
Nice.
of it and I'm looking forward to it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. How are you?
I am doing great. My daughter started horseback riding camp today, so it makes for a slightly complicated week because it's means there's an extra drop off and pickup every single day of the week. But nevertheless, we are in a place where my daughter gets to go to horseback riding camp, and I love that. And my son is just drove off to work just before we started recording. So I'm enjoying this phase of parenting when my children have semi-independent lives.
Yeah. Do you know, though, it's ironic to me that your daughter has to be driven to horseback riding lessons where she gets on a form of locomotion that does
Yes.
not take her back home or transport her anywhere.
It's
And
so
then
true.
you have to go pick her up. Like, can't
Yeah,
you just take the horse home?
I wish. She probably wishes too.
Yeah.
But whenever the apocalypse comes and electricity ceases to work, she will be far more prepared than the rest of us.
Yes. Yes, I suppose so.
So I'm looking forward to that.
I'm not, but okay. All right. Well, apocalypse and horseback riding is not today's topic. So what is?
Oh man, I texted you how much I enjoyed the sermon that my pastor preached last week in church and actually asked you to listen to it because I wanted to get to talk about it. We have at my church been going through the book of Luke. We are on chapter 10. We started, I think, 9 or 10 months ago, and we have just been slowly and very meditatively going through the Gospel of Luke, trying to really wrap our minds around what Luke is trying to say. And we got to what may be one of the two most famous texts in the entire Bible. I think the two most famous texts in the Bible probably are Psalm 23 and the Good Samaritan. Does that seem fair?
I think John 3:16 deserves a place somewhere in there.
Ooh, yep. And maybe the Beatitudes, which we did recently as well.
We're just kind of
And
doing a tour
yeah,
of the greatest hits.
yeah, exactly. But I loved my pastor's take on the Good Samaritan. It's always interesting to hear somebody preach on a text that is so familiar. And there's this interesting challenge. You don't want to be novel as a preacher, or at least if you do, you're probably already off base before you started.
Hmm, right.
And on the flip side, you don't want to just open the text and say, well, you all know what this said, so have a good week. Um, right.
Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
so I have been loving the series. I love his approach to preaching. And so I just texted you this sermon and said, hey, listen to this. I want to get to talk about it. So here we are. I want to talk about the Good Samaritan and the sermon that my pastor preached last week on the Good Samaritan.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to this. I have to say, I loved the sermon. I thought it was fantastic. It had so much rich content to it. I learned stuff from the sermon. I was challenged by the sermon. It just so many good things about it. But in the name of like the three circles that we keep coming back to, right? The Father doctrine churches, the Spirit helping hands of Jesus churches, or the Jesus churches, and then the Spirit churches. You belong to an AOG church, which I think most people put into the Spirit category, but this sermon sure felt like you've got a closet Baptist as a pastor.
If he listens to this, I'll be curious what he thinks of that. But the church definitely has a clear love for biblical and godly thinking that inspires action. But if
Mm,
if we were to stack those up with one of them needing to be the foundation, clearly the foundation is thinking biblically and thinking deeply and biblically.
yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. I'm curious, what were your takeaways or what was your response as you listened to it?
Well, I thought it was really interesting because one of the things that he pointed out, something I didn't know before, is really the full definition of what the inquirer's role was. The person who came to ask Jesus, who is my neighbor and that kind of thing, he is kind of a professional theoretician, if you will, on the scriptures. And so all of these matters of the law were brought to these professional thinkers who have teased out the full implications of the law. And so he's wrestling in kind of a more intellectual way with, okay, well, what does it really mean? Who is my neighbor? And the fact that this person was predisposed to think more abstractly and more detached from the doing and much more to the idea was fascinating to me. I just had never really understood that person's role in quite that same way.
Yeah, I found that fascinating as well. And it really gives a lot of light to the opening dialogue between Jesus and this lawyer is what the ESV uses, but this sort of academic.
Yeah.
Even when the lawyer asks, "How do I inherit eternal life?" for Jesus to just sort of respond with, "What's written in the law? How do you read it?" rather than taking a swing at it himself, is in the context of an academic sort of debate that is being enjoined. It's almost like Jesus doesn't take the bait.
Or that Jesus is well versed in this type of thing and just says, okay, let's go there. How do you read this?
Mm,
And I found that really fascinating to just like, Jesus knows how this dialogue goes. All right,
yeah.
what are your foundational assumptions here? How do you put all of the pieces together? And honestly, he gives a great answer. He gives an answer that Jesus himself gives. And so Jesus is like, yeah, great, good answer. Go do that. So I think it's fascinating. I think that was the first fascinating part of the whole sermon for me was in some ways, I found it reminiscent of some of the things that you and I like to do. We sit
Hmm.
around and kick around ideas and try to understand scripture and what does it really mean. And, we kind of sometimes have these detached ideas and we're trying to wrestle with them. But what I hope is that we also bring it back down to real life nitty gritty, like, okay, then how do we live this out? And clearly that's what Jesus turns and does with this person. And I don't know that that was necessarily a part of this person's habit, or maybe not in at least quite the same way.
Yeah. To tell this visceral story. Again, and I don't remember if when he was preaching, he mentioned whether this was normal or not, but I'm curious if this sort of anecdotal kind of argument, telling parables in the middle of a debate, was part of the norm or not. I don't know the answer to that.
Oh,
Um,
I don't either. I've always equated that with Jesus and not necessarily with the methodologies of the day. But that's just my own assumptions. I have no idea if that's true or not.
yeah, me either. I'm because this is either a fascinating way of living into the normal way of arguing. Let me tell you this story and then you think about it. Or it is Jesus just blowing the cover off the standard arguing approach, right? And I just have no idea which one it is.
Well, even if it were a common device, Jesus is clearly a master of it.
Mm.
Right before you and I jumped on to record this podcast, I was translating in Matthew with my friend John, and we were dealing with, the laborers in the field, and Jesus agrees to pay them each a denarius, and then he keeps hiring guys all throughout the day and even down to the final hour, and he pays them all a denarius, and the guys that were hired first are like, what the heck? And John and I were marveling at the fact that Jesus uses such an earthy story that we can relate to 2,000 years later. And we're both like, I would have been just as irritated as these guys, right? Like this is not fair. And I think Jesus grasped inherently how unfair that was and how people were going to be able to relate to that. And then he used that as a springboard for his own methodologies, his own intentions, what his own teaching. And so I just feel like even if this was common, Jesus was clearly a master of it because we're still wrestling with this stuff 2,000 years later.
Absolutely. Well, and you hit on, I think, what is one of the most important sort of interpretive moves in reading the parables, which is which character's shoes am I stepping into here?
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating with that other parable, the parable of the farmer and the tenants. Even in that, you instinctively step into the shoes of the quote unquote unfairly paid hard workers, which is clearly what Jesus is setting us up to do.
Right. But if we took the time to put ourselves in a different set of shoes, and we put ourselves in the shoes of the workers who only had to work 1 hour and got a full day's wage, well, yeah, that feels a little different. That feels pretty amazing. And so I think that's the beauty of the parable is like you instinctively put yourself in one place, but then you're invited to stop and go, but wait a minute, what might it feel like to be in a different person's shoes in this story? And how does that change how I view the whole story?
Yeah, well, and I'm curious how you think that relates to the sermon and the parable of the Good Samaritan as he was preaching it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it relates directly to the way your pastor preached it. It's so fascinating that both of these things are happening for me on the same day, right? I actually got up early this morning. I listened to the sermon, then I was translating, and now we're recording. And it's all, again, both these stories are coming together to say, which shoes are we invited to step into here? And I think that was your pastor's point, that the language shifts in the story such that you're invited to see the story through the lens of the person who was beat up and who acted toward you like a neighbor. And that's very different. And I don't think I don't tend to read the story that way, but I think he makes a really good point.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this. I think, at least for me, maybe for most of us as followers of Jesus, maybe for all people, it's so tempting to think of myself as the good person who's doing somebody else a favor, right?
Yeah.
As reflected in the lawyer's initial question. Okay, then who's my neighbor? What an academic, detached question.
Yeah.
And what a presumptuous question, which I'd never caught before. As if I'm all set. And so my real spiritual question needs to be, who can I do a favor for?
Yeah.
Right? Like there's just a level of assuming that I have it all together. I'm all set. I don't need anything. You can almost hear the haughty accent. All right, then who's my neighbor? Right?
Yeah, right? Yeah, who am I supposed to help? Because clearly I don't need the help. So who am I supposed to help?
Exactly. And Jesus just flips that on its head, and you land in this story being the beaten up person in desperate need of help.
Yeah, I really like how your pastor keyed in on the shift in language at the end of the parable, where Jesus says, "So who acted like a neighbor to that guy?" It changes the question entirely. It's no longer, "I have it all together. Who am I supposed to go bless?" It's, "I'm beat up and mugged. Who's going to be my neighbor?"
Yeah. And as an interesting caveat, he was telling me just yesterday when I was at church, he said a lot of more liberal commentaries just assume Luke messed it up at the end.
Hmm.
They assume he transposes the question wrong. Jesus' question should have matched the lawyers at the beginning, and Luke just messes it up.
That's so fascinating that that would be the assumption. That seems contrary to everything we see in the Gospels. I feel like every single time we want Jesus to zig, he zags. He's constantly going in a direction where we're not expecting.
Absolutely. Well, and to subtly and powerfully undermine the lawyer's confidence in his own goodness seems very consistent with Jesus.
Yeah.
No, no, you think you're the scribe walking by, but you're not. You're the guy who got beat up and is lying nearly dead.
Yeah, I definitely think we're invited to step into those shoes. I'm wondering, though, at the entire time I listened to that portion of the sermon, I was wondering how it accords with the next line that Jesus gives, which is, "Go and do likewise."
Mm.
I mean, if your pastor's interpretation is correct, and I think there's a lot of merit to it, how does it accord with "go and do likewise"? That seems to indicate we're to go and be like the Samaritan.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is, and this is, I'm shooting off the cuff here. Certainly, I don't think the point of the sermon was you are off the hook. You don't have to be a good Samaritan.
Sure.
Right. I think it was the kind of the order of operations that's being readjusted here in terms of if you want to be a person who shows mercy, the first step is to recognize yourself as someone who has received mercy.
Or at the very least, is in desperate need of it.
Yes. And this rings true to me, A, in real life, and B, theologically. I think when we try to show mercy from a position of confidence and sort of, I've got it all together, I think that there can be something condescending about it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
On the flip side, I think that if all we do is recognize our own need for mercy and try to show mercy out of our own lack, I think it can become easily something in the realm of codependent.
Hmm.
But if we recognize that we have had a lack that someone loved us enough to fill, then suddenly my mercy is coming from a humble but healthy place. And that is the go and do likewise, I think.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's almost as though we're invited to stay in the shoes of the unnamed beat up person who received help from his neighbor that he would have never expected to be his neighbor. And now that he's healed, now that he can walk away from the inn with all of his wounds restored, now he's to go and do like he received.
Yeah, I think that that is generally what I'm hearing. What do you think?
I mean, it certainly helps me put those those two statements next to each other, right? Who do you think was a neighbor to the one that was beat up, and go and do likewise? I think it helps me put those things together and gives me more confidence than I even had before about this interpretation of the parable.
Which if we hold this as a way of reading this parable, if I am not the Good Samaritan, if I am the beat up guy, the question that I think my pastor only loosely implied an answer to is, so who's the Good Samaritan?
Hmm.
Who's the one who's actually unexpectedly showing mercy?
Is that Jesus? Is that what you're saying?
It appears to me that that may be, I don't want to go so far as to say what Jesus was saying, but a way of reading it. There is something certainly unexpected about Jesus being the one to fulfill all of God's promises. So there's an unexpectedness that matches up. And certainly that is where we ultimately end up receiving the mercy that brings us to health. So, like, theologically, you can draw those lines, right? Or you can connect those dots. But what do you think about that?
It's such a brand new thought to me that I'm not really sure what to think of that. But I mean, sure, yeah. I mean, it seems logical if that's how we're reading the parable, that if we're the beat up one, who do we get our mercy from? Well, it's Jesus.
And it would have this interesting, if by creating the story such that the Good Samaritan is the merciful character, one of the points is you will receive mercy where you least expect it. And the good, quote unquote, good person is sort of hidden in plain sight. And
Hmm.
that too would be nearly blasphemous if Yahweh's Messiah is reconstituted in this story as a Samaritan. But it also is a really potentially brilliant analogy. One of the things that Chase has been saying, Chase is my pastor's name, throughout the Gospel of Luke, is how often Jesus is having to dismantle expectations in
Yeah.
order to be seen for who he truly is. And this story could easily be a brilliant way of dismantling expectations about where mercy is going to come from.
Right. Well, and I think about it particularly from the lawyer's perspective, the inquirer's perspective. Why did he come to Jesus at all? Did he come to Jesus because he saw Jesus as some sort of superior rabbi who was going to have a good answer? Or did he come testing Jesus to see if his theology was sound? And I think Jesus had this reputation among the professional church people that he was kind of a rogue preacher that was distorting the Old Testament, that was not living according to all of the specialized rules that all agreed that was super important. And he was pointing people in a direction that the church officials were not pointing people. So I feel like they saw Jesus teaching a bastardized version of the Old Testament and disregarding certain things that they held to be very important. And so, I mean, I think that just makes Jesus the Samaritan in the story, the half-breed that doesn't really get it.
Well, and it even, you come to this idea of half-breed. To what degree was Jesus' parentage still being questioned by his adulthood?
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating.
Right? You know, clearly Mary got pregnant before she got married.
Right.
If they're still asking that question about Jesus' parentage, Jesus putting himself in the position of a Samaritan isn't a giant leap.
No,
On
yeah,
some level, he does have Jewish and non-Jewish parents, right? God is not distinctively Jewish any more than he is anything else.
sure. You're right.
I actually, well, maybe Jesus did at times think of himself as a Samaritan in that way.
Huh. This is all super fascinating, but I think we've edged into the detached sort of like
Yes,
interesting
that's fair.
ideas. So I'm going to be spinning on that for a while. But to bring it back a little bit more to the
Yeah.
heart of this, I had a similar experience to this sermon as I did the sermon that we just had yesterday at church. Yesterday, our sermon was on petition prayer, and it was actually our youth pastor that was preaching, and he did an amazing job. He started with an opening illustration that we could all connect to. He was talking about being out on the river with like his very humble boat, and they were enjoying their time. They were cruising around, and then his engine died, like irreparably died. And he had to like wave his flag and try to get help. And here comes this 3-story yacht that's like, I'll come and help. And he's like, oh my gosh, me and my humble boat and my weak little flag. And I have to like stand here and let these guys come and help me. And it was so embarrassing for him. And just like, he just didn't even want to do it. The story goes on. It's very well told and all of that, but it's something we can all relate to. I don't want to be the guy that needs help. I don't
Hmm.
want to admit that I need these things. And I think that was the invitation that Jesus was giving in this parable and many other places. Stop and acknowledge your own need and receive that. And then out of that experience, serve others.
Well, and this is very consistent with what we were talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. There is a sense in the Beatitudes that those who are blessed are those who know their own desperate need.
Mm, yep.
And for Jesus to use this story to position us to have the humility to admit, man, I am the guy in the dinky little boat. I am the guy who's beat up by the side of the road.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah. I think particularly for the professional church people,
Hmm.
I think this is why Jesus really praises a lot of these other characters in the Gospels that just seem to grasp their need without it having to be told to them, right? Like when a prostitute comes and anoints Jesus's feet with oil and uses her hair to wipe his feet, and she gets her loneliness straight out of the gate. Nobody has to teach her that. But this lawyer fellow who is looked upon by everybody in the community as the guy to go to for answers on the law, and he knows the Old Testament scriptures inside and out, and honestly genuinely knows them, because he even gives the same answer that Jesus would have given to like, how do you read the scriptures? It's like he knows his stuff. And yet what he has to learn is how to be humble like that prostitute, or like the guy that was beaten up on the side of the road and maybe shouldn't have even been there in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And this sort of unself-conscious humility in response to Jesus has been one of the running themes that our slow, meandering way through Luke has really exposed. You have early on, you have the teachers of the law again who are like coming to question Jesus, the people in his hometown who are expecting a certain kind of sermon when he preaches among them, and the other towns that are looking for miracles and having a sense of being due the miracles that all the other towns got, and all this sort of expectations piled on Jesus. And in the middle of all of this, Jesus calls Peter, and Peter just comes to Jesus and drops to his knees and just says something to the effect of, I'm not worthy.
Hmm.
Like, I shouldn't even be in your presence. Again, this sort of unself conscious response that even later Peter, and I think this is indicative of the challenge you're describing. I don't know that Peter maintains that ability to respond. The longer he knows Jesus, the more he ends up thinking of himself as one of the guys who ought to know things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's honestly, this is so funny. We're actually double recording today. And as soon as we finish this one, we're going to record one of our Revelation episodes. And this is actually a thought that I'm going to talk about in the Revelation episode. I think that's what Eugene Peterson encourages us to see worship as doing. Worship is kind of the linchpin that helps us maintain proper perspective, that our desperate need and God's gracious gift, they kind of come together in the act of worship. You can't worship somebody or even something unless you see it as in some way greater than you.
Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that is true. It's not just that it's, or in this case, he is greater. It's that you are less.
Yeah.
There is not just a deep respect for God, but a deep humility about me that is required.
Yeah.
I think this story invites us into that place. Like if I pause and instead of asking, which of the three characters am I most like? If I start asking myself, in what way am I beaten, broken, and unable to move forward? It offers me an answer to where I can invite God to act in my life
Yeah.
rather than where I can act in someone else's life.
Well, and I think that's the beauty of the Psalms as well. And we're right in the middle of this Summer in the Psalm series. And I think the psalmists get this right consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Here is my need. You are the one I come to. I acknowledge that you are the one that is going to come meet my need. And then I will praise you. That is kind of the order of nearly every psalm. Here's my need. You're the guy I go to. I praise you.
Mm-hmm.
It's the right order.
And bringing that to God, over and over again, I am struck by the fact that the Psalms, they are a redirected emotional output instead of taking action myself and instead of gossip, which are what I think we are often prone to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to vent about this by talking to somebody. I'm going to fix this myself. And the Psalms take all the emotional energy, all the angst, frustration, hurt, anger. And it shocks me on some level that we are shocked by the Psalms, but not shocked by gossip. Right?
Right.
We are shocked by the Psalms' very edgy language towards God, but not shocked by the host of times we have taken that same angst into our own hands in order to act in foolish ways.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way, but you're exactly right. We're surprised when we take that energy and turn it into a prayer, which should be our natural experience or should be our natural inclination, but it almost never is.
No, I think I could very easily see someone saying, well, that doesn't come naturally to me. It doesn't have the same cathartic experience for me as talking to my best friend or, whatever. And I think the answer is, yeah, that's why it needed to be in the Bible. We need to retrain ourselves to do things that are not natural because they are healthier and better, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're natural.
Right. Well, this is the motivation for our Summer in the Psalms series, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get this mentality embedded in us by reading the Psalms together every year.
Exactly.
Year after year after year. So before we get to our Summer in the Psalms thoughts, I want to invite the audience to participate in this conversation. You can always connect with us over social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, but whether you connect with us or whether you connect with a friend, engage in this thought. What does the Good Samaritan story invite us to do? Whose perspective are we invited to take? And how does that work out in the real world? I'd love
Mm.
to engage with you or have you engage with someone else about that very idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And since we're talking about the Psalms, Josh, I'd love to hear your Summer on the Psalms thoughts for this week.
Yeah, so my
Did I
thought
say
is,
Summer on the Psalms?
I don't
I think
know.
I said Summer on the Psalms. We're going to Summer in the Psalms thoughts for this week.
Well, on that score, and in this way, I'm going to answer your question. I honestly have just a really simple thought, and that is not necessarily about the Psalms, but much more about the methodology. I have learned that to really grasp the Psalms, I need to read them in print. I have listened to the Psalms quite a bit, and the narration goes by too quickly.
Mm,
I think poetry in general, and the Psalms in particular, invite you to dwell or stay with a thought a little bit longer. And I never know when that pause is going to be required, right? A word might stick out, or a phrase might stick out, or the sum total of the psalm to that point may be sticking out. And I just need to stop and I need to linger with that, which is interesting that so often in the Psalms you have that Selah, which a lot of people say just means pause. I think it just requires a pause, and listening to the Psalms has not done it for me. I've really learned I need to be reading them in print, and sometimes in a couple of different translations, and sometimes I found actually on my phone I can put like the ESV on the top part of my phone and then the Hebrew Bible on the bottom part of my phone. And so for the most part, I'm just reading the ESV, but occasionally I'm like, wait a minute, what word are they translating there? And I can jump down to the Hebrew, and that's been really, really fun. Just helped me engage with the ideas a little bit more deeply. So yeah, that's it. I need to read in print. That's my thought this week.
that totally makes sense to me. And I love the fact that you're interested in reading slowly because I think some things are written to be read slowly. Not to say that somebody else shouldn't read it a different way, but I think one of the things we have to be willing to do is gear shift in order to learn best what is going to work for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Which exactly. And I had built my Summer in the Psalms reading schedule around being able to listen in the car, and it's not working. So now I have to shift gears, and that makes it more complicated, but hopefully richer for it.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, my thought is from the psalm that we were supposed to finish reading today or yesterday or something like that. Psalm 78, which is a really long one. Psalm 78 is one of these history of the story of God and Israel psalms. Let's recount what God has done and why Israel has been unfaithful and God has been faithful, is kind of
Yeah.
the theme. And I love the introduction to this as translated by Peterson. I'm chewing on the morsel of a proverb, is one of the lines that Peterson translates at the beginning. And I love this sort of view of the psalm as a meditation on the history of the work of God. Not just me reading it, but the writing of it is a meditation on the history of the work of God in the world.
Mm.
And that's really powerful. But what my actual thought here, it really walks very carefully through the plagues that rescue Israel from Egypt, then the wilderness wandering years, and it lines out every act of unfaithfulness over and over and over and over again throughout those years. And then it jumps a little bit forward and says, then he chose David his servant, handpicked him from his work in the sheep pens, One day he was caring for the ewes and their lambs. The next day, God had him shepherding Jacob, his people Israel, his prized possession. His good heart made him a good shepherd. He guided the people wisely and well. Full stop, end of very long psalm.
Hmm.
And it's this very jarring reminder to me of how desperately, and my first thought was, well, David sort of did that. I don't know that, but even the failure of David to live up to these words about David is a reminder of how much is missing in the Davidic king, and how much, you were saying this about a psalm, I think the other day, that it was written long after the Davidic kingship. And so it is even the reminder of the Davidic kingship is a longing for kingship. And I think both the failings of Israel as outlined in this psalm and this very abrupt ending are this desperate longing for kingship that begins to be fulfilled in Jesus, but that, at least as I look at the world around me and my own life and the life of the church, I am continually reminded we need the king to come.
I like both of the thoughts that you gave. You kind of threw out an anecdotal thought at the beginning, but I'm marrying the two in my reflections on what you've said and thinking about what it would have been like for the author of this psalm to sit down with that longing and to recount Israel's history up to and stopping at the time of David and thinking, this is how God has been faithful to his people, and all the way down to this kingship that has been idealized in our cultural memory. And that is what we're longing for. And the whole exercise of writing this psalm is an act of longing. So Eugene Peterson, we're going to talk about Eugene Peterson in our Revelation episode that we're going to record in about 10 minutes here. And he talks about preaching as the act, and both preaching and taking communion as these acts that tie together history and eschatology. What has gone before and what is encroaching upon the now from the future. And I think that is what the psalmist is experiencing. He's recounting history and anticipating the encroachment of the future on the now, when God faithfully brings in his messianic king once again.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so one of the things that Peterson says is that the book of Revelation is a meditation on and reconstitution of all the major themes of the Bible.
Particularly the Psalms.
Particularly the Psalms. And so it is not shocking that this book of Revelation leads us to end with prayer that voices this longing. Come, Lord Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the church is not what it could be. We've been unfaithful, just like Israel's been unfaithful. The world is broken. We are the character in the Good Samaritan that is broken and bloodied. And we are desperately longing for you to come by and make things right. How'd you like that for a tie-in? I just wrapped it all up neat with a bow. That was amazing.
You tied together our Revelation study, our Psalm study, and this episode all in one little fell swoop. That was...
And I astound myself.
Yes. Yes. Would you like to demoralize yourself?
Yes. Are you ready for a Which Josh question?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Which Josh has a redneck recliner?
That is me. I have a redneck recliner. So first of all, I got to tell you the history of this recliner. I bought this recliner just before I started seminary. And I very intentionally bought this recliner as like, this is the place where I'm going to sit and do my massive amounts of reading. And I did. Like, I am very well acquainted with this recliner. I have spent hours sitting in this recliner reading books. I cannot count the amount of time I've spent in this recliner. So it's well worn. It's well loved. And the other day I went to open the recliner. Like I pulled the little lever and it snapped. Not the actual, not the actual lever, but the tension cord in the inside of the recliner that connects the handle to the actual lever mechanism. Like that whole tension cord just snapped. And so now you can pull the handle all you want and it does nothing. And so I was like, oh, that stinks. I mean, I only paid $100 for this recliner. This is not like the world's most expensive purchase, but like I have spent a lot of time with this thing. And so I was like, I don't know that I can use this anymore. And then my 20-year-old son comes along and he's like, I got this. And he finds like some baling twine kind of stuff and like ties it to the release mechanism and then like strings it out the back of the recliner and ties a loop into it. And so now rather than pulling the handle, you just like reach behind you and pull this little loop.
My goodness.
Yeah, it is phenomenal. And so now I am still using my $100 recliner that is a little more redneck than it used to be. That's great.
What I am picturing more than anything else is the smile and look of pride on your son's face when he had successfully fixed this.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Like one of those stupid grins that's like, this is awesome.
Except that I don't want to call it a stupid grin because I stink at fixing things. So it's like, I don't want to imply on any level disrespect for the amount of creativity and ingenuity it takes to be able to like fix stuff with other stuff.
Oh, no. I hopefully I was not implying that either if my son listens to this. No, I actually he does this all the time. Like I had a problem with my weed eater the other day. I had like screwed up how I like attached the head to the weed eater. And I was like, I tried and I could not get the thing to work right. And so I needed him. I was like, dude, come be a redneck for me. I don't know how to do this. Like, help me. And sure enough, like we worked the problem for a while. He didn't just like magically have a solution, but over the course of like 20 minutes working together, he was like, I got this. And he totally came up with the right solution. It was just, anyway, he just creatively uses other things to fix problems. And I love it. So
there is a genuine creativity in that I do not have, that I just love.
Yes. Same. So now I have a redneck recliner.
Oh, that's great. Well, congratulations. You'll have to give us an update if and when the time comes that it somehow has duct tape essentially upon it.
All right.
You want to talk again next week?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. I'll talk to you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.